The dog had been barking for 3 hours, and nobody in the village had slept. Then, without warning, it stopped. That silence, the sudden total absence of the one sound that had been keeping everyone anchored to the world, was somehow worse. A woman named Astrid lay on her sleeping platform inside the longhouse, her eyes open in the dark, her hand resting flat against the wool blanket beneath her, feeling the rough weave of it against her palm. She did not move. She was listening so hard it almost hurt. This is where we are going tonight. Settle in, pull the blanket a little closer, because this story deserves your full stillness, and what you are about to understand has been waiting a very long time to be understood. A Viking village at night was not the world you live in. There were no streetlights bleeding orange into the sky, no hum of electricity behind the walls, no cars in the distance reminding you softly and constantly that other people exist and that the world is still running. There was only the dark, and it was a dark so complete, so absolute, that it had texture. It pressed against the eyes. It sat on the chest. It made you aware, in a way that modern life never allows, that you were a very small thing in a very large night. And the dog had stopped barking. Astrid's husband Bjorn had not moved beside her, but she could tell by the quality of his stillness that he was awake. In a longhouse shared with 12 other people, cousins, parents, children, the elderly grandmother who coughed through every winter, there was a particular texture to collective waking that was different from collective sleep. The air felt different, more careful. The breathing of 12 people trying not to breathe too loudly has a sound of its own. Outside, the village was organized in the way that Viking settlements always were, tight, deliberate, built less for beauty than for defense. The longhouses faced inward, the livestock were penned close, the paths between buildings were narrow enough that 2 men passing each other in daylight would brush shoulders. At night, those same paths became something else entirely. Nobody went out after dark without a reason. Not because they had been told not to, because they understood in their bodies what the dark contained. The dog had barked because dogs bark at things that move at the edge of the firelight. And now it was not barking, which meant one of 2 things. Either whatever had been out there was gone, or the dog was. Astrid pulled the blanket to her chin. She did not wake her husband. She did not make a sound. She only lay there, in the thick dark, in the particular silence of a village that has suddenly remembered what it is afraid of. Somewhere across the settlement, a child murmured in its sleep. No one answered. People often imagine the Viking longhouse as a home. It was, of course, but to think of it only that way is to misunderstand it entirely, the way you might misunderstand a fortress by noticing only its curtains. The walls were thick, not elegantly thick, not architecturally considered thick, but thick in the way that comes from knowing, in your lived experience, that the world outside your walls has teeth. They were built from timber and turf, from whatever the land nearby would give, packed and layered and sometimes reinforced with stone at the base. When you pressed your hand against the interior wall of a longhouse in winter, you felt the cold trying to come through, slowly, steadily, the way a patient thing waits, and you were grateful for every inch of what stood between you and it. Inside, the longhouse smelled of smoke and animals and bodies and food, a smell that, to modern sensibilities, might seem oppressive, but which to the people who lived inside it was the smell of alive. The central fire burned low through the night, tended by whoever's turn it was to tend it, because a fire that died in the night was not a small inconvenience. It was a very serious problem. Heat meant survival. Light meant something more. Because here is what the darkness outside the longhouse actually contained, and it is worth sitting with this for a moment, worth letting it settle into your understanding quietly. There were wolves, not the distant romantic wolves of modern imagination, not animals seen briefly across a hillside and then gone. These were wolves that came to the edges of settlements because settlements had livestock, and livestock was food, and hunger makes the wild world braver than people prefer. The farmers of Scandinavia did not romanticize wolves. They feared them with the practical, specific fear of people who had lost animals to them, who had found what remained of a sheep in the grey morning light, and understood exactly what had visited in the night. There were bears in the deeper forests. There were wild boar, which are, despite everything you might assume, genuinely dangerous animals when frightened or cornered in the dark. And the dark was very good at frightening things. There were the simple, unglamorous hazards of terrain in the absence of light, the drop at the edge of the bluff, the half-frozen stream, the tree root that caught a running foot and sent a body to the ground at speed. And then there were the things that could not be named so cleanly. A man named Gunnar lived in a settlement in what is now western Norway, and he was known in his village for sleeping closest to the door, by choice. Always by choice, though he never explained why. The others assumed it was bravado. They were wrong. Gunnar slept closest to the door because he believed, quietly and without apology, that if something came through it in the night, he wanted to be the first to know. That is not bravado. That is the particular courage of someone who has accepted the darkness for what it is and decided to face it from the front. The walls were thick. The fire burned low, and outside the night continued its patient work. You could tell a great deal about what was happening in the darkness by learning to listen to the animals. This was not a skill taught formally, not written in any text, not passed down in any way that history has preserved. It was simply absorbed, the way all truly essential knowledge is absorbed, through years of proximity to a world that communicated constantly in a language most people had forgotten how to hear. The farmers and fisherfolk and craftspeople of Viking Age Scandinavia were not naturalists in any academic sense, but they knew the difference between the howl of a wolf that was moving through territory and the howl of a wolf that had found something. They knew the difference between geese disturbed by wind and geese disturbed by a human shape moving through the dark. They knew when a horse was uneasy and when a horse was terrified, and they knew what each meant about what was standing just beyond the firelight. The wolves were perhaps the most legible of the wild languages. They spoke in a grammar of distance and direction and urgency. A howl far off, carrying over the treetops on a still night, was news from another world, real but remote, something to be noted and filed away. A howl that had no distance in it, a howl that seemed to come from the tree line itself, the dark edge of the forest where the settlement's cleared land simply stopped, and the wild began. That was something else. That was the sound that made men reach in the dark for whatever was closest to them that could be used in their defense. Take one slow breath, because what we are talking about, underneath the wolves and the darkness and the cold, is the feeling of being genuinely, existentially small. Not small in the way a bad day at work makes you feel small, small in the way that a species feels small, out at the very edge of the firelight, knowing that the light only reaches so far. A young man named Leif, 16, broad-shouldered in the way of someone who had been working since he could walk, was sent to check the animal pen one autumn night when the livestock grew suddenly loud. This was simply what happened. The animals made noise. Someone went to look. It was his turn. He took a torch, cupped his hand around the flame against the wind, and walked the 30 feet from the longhouse door to the pen where the goats were kept. The goats were pressed against the far side of the pen, all of them, facing the same direction, staring at something in the dark that Leif could not see. He stood there with his torch, this 16-year-old boy in a world that had not yet invented the comfort of knowing that someone would come if you called for help. And he looked at where the goats were looking. The flame bent sideways in a breath of wind. The shadows moved. Whatever was out there, wolf, bear, or simply the darkness itself playing tricks on a tired mind, was gone by morning. But Leif never volunteered for night watch again, and no one asked him why. Her name was Ragnhild, and she had not slept a full night in 11 years. Not since the winter her mother had handed her the responsibility, not with ceremony, not with any particular weight of words, just a nod across the longhouse fire that meant, "This is yours now," the tending of the flame, the watching through the dark hours, the making sure. In a settlement of 40 people, this task fell always to someone, and for Ragnhild it had fallen early, the way certain responsibilities find the people built to carry them before those people have any say in the matter. She was not unhappy. That is the first thing to understand, because it is tempting to frame her life as a kind of quiet suffering, and that would be a dishonesty. She was practical in the way that survival made people practical, and she found in the nighttime hours a kind of company that the daylight never offered. The long house at night, when the others slept, when even the children had finally stilled their restless bodies, and the grandmother's coughing had softened into the irregular rhythm of sleep, had a quality that Ragnhild could not have named, but would have recognized instantly if you described it to her. It was the feeling of being the only person awake in a world that needed someone to be awake. She kept the fire with small additions, not great armfuls of wood that would flare and wake the sleepers, but careful, considered pieces fed in at angles that encouraged burning without drama. It was an art, and she knew it was an art, even if no one had ever called it that. The fire could not go out, not in the practical sense of inconvenience, but in the sense of survival. A fire gone cold on a winter night in Scandinavia was a crisis that moved fast and offered no negotiation. But the fire was more than heat, and Ragnhild knew this too. Light was the argument the living made against the dark. It was the visible, continuous proof that the settlement was awake, was present, was defended. A fire visible through the smoke hole of a long house said to anyone or anything approaching through the trees, "We are here, we are warm, we are not easy." A dark long house said something else. A dark long house said, "Come and see." And so she fed tea. He fire its small, careful meals through the long hours. And she listened to the night. She had learned its rhythms over 11 years until they were as familiar as breathing. She knew the particular way the wind moved across the roof at different hours. She knew the sound of the settlement's oldest dog, not the young one that barked at everything, but the old one, nearly toothless, who only raised his voice when something was genuinely wrong. On the night we are speaking of, the old dog had not made a sound. Ragnhild noticed this. She did not wake anyone. She only sat a little straighter by the fire, fed it one more careful piece of wood, and watched the door with the particular, patient attention of someone who has spent 11 years learning that the night will always, eventually, tell you what it means. She was 31 years old. She would tend this fire for another 20 years, and some of those nights would be very long. The thing about a raid is that by the time you know it is happening, it is already too late to prevent it. This is the truth that Viking Age communities lived with so constantly that it had stopped being a thought and had become, instead, a sensation, a low, persistent awareness that lived somewhere between the shoulder blades, that tightened slightly whenever the night was unusually still. The raid was not merely a historical phenomenon, a thing that happened to other people in other places and was reported afterward. It was a present tense possibility. It was the reason settlements were built the way they were built, the reason dogs were kept the way dogs were kept, the reason someone like Ragnhild existed at all. Because a community that could be surprised in its sleep was a community that could be undone. Raiders, whether Norsemen striking foreign coasts or rival settlers striking neighbouring valleys, shared a single tactical understanding. That required no strategy meeting to establish, because it was simply obvious. Silence was the weapon, not swords, not numbers, not speed, though all of those mattered too. Silence first, because a settlement that heard you coming was a settlement that had time to respond, and a settlement that had time to respond was a settlement that became dangerous, and so they came quietly. This is the detail that history books rarely linger on, the extraordinary discipline of approach. Men moving through forest and across open ground in the dark, navigating by starlight and the distant glow of a settlement's hearth fire, communicating by touch and by signals agreed upon long before the night began. A hand on a shoulder meant stop, a double tap meant move. No voice, no metal on metal if it could be helped, no footfall heavier than necessary. Dozens of men, sometimes, moving across dark ground with the collective silence of something held very carefully between two hands. The settlements that survived the longest were the ones that understood this. They built their alertness into the landscape itself. Dogs whose instincts were sharper than any human watchman. Animals whose behavioral changes were legible to anyone paying attention. A fire kept burning not merely for warmth, but for the information it broadcast and the information it allowed its keeper to receive. A man who led raids along a particular stretch of coastline, a man history has not preserved by name, which is its own kind of justice, was known among his crew for one rule above all others. He would call off an approach if the village dogs had not started barking, not because a quiet dog meant no danger to him, because a quiet dog meant the settlement was already alert, already watching, already waiting. He had learned this rule from a night that had gone wrong in a way he did not like to think about. The silence before a raid was the silence of intention, of held breath and careful placement, of human beings reducing themselves to the darkness around them. And somewhere in those settlements, always, there was someone sitting awake by a fire, a Ragnhild, a gunner, a leaf grown older and warier, who was listening so carefully that the silence itself had become a kind of sound. That sound had a texture, and those who knew it recognized it immediately. There was a creature that lived in the water beneath the ice. Every child in the village knew this, not because they had been frightened into it carelessly, not as punishment or as cruelty, but because the adults who told them were passing on the oldest kind of knowledge, the kind that keeps small bodies away from frozen rivers on dark winter afternoons, the kind that makes a child hesitate at the treeline and come home while there is still light. The creature had a name that varied from settlement to settlement, from valley to valley, from the memory of one grandmother to the memory of another. But its function was universal. It lived in the dangerous places, and it wanted children, and it was most powerful in the dark. You might hear this and feel from the comfortable distance of the present a small ache of sympathy for those children. And that ache is not wrong, but it is incomplete because the adults who told these stories were not being cruel. They were being, in the most fundamental sense of the word, protective. In a world where a frozen river genuinely could kill a child who wandered onto it alone, and where the forest genuinely did contain things that posed real danger, and where the dark genuinely was a time of elevated risk, a story that kept small feet indoors was a story that kept small feet alive. Fear, in the Viking world, was not a weakness. It was information. A girl named Solveig, 7 years old, sharp-eyed the kind, of child who asked questions that adults had to think carefully about before answering, had been told the stories like all the others. The creature in the water, the shape-shifter in the forest, the dead who walked at certain times of year through the borderlands between worlds. She had listened to all of them with the focused attention of a child who is filing things away rather than simply receiving them. And she had asked her grandmother once whether any of it was true. Her grandmother had looked at her for a long moment before answering. Some of it, she had said, but not all in the way you think. Solveig had considered this. Which parts? The parts that make you careful, her grandmother said. Those parts are always true. This was the inheritance, not the specific creature, not the specific story, but the orientation it produced, an alertness to the world, a respect for the dark, a knowledge that safety was not a permanent condition but a continuous achievement. Children raised with this understanding grew into adults who knew how to listen, how to read the behavior of animals, how to notice when the night had changed its quality. They also, many of them, slept with their backs against the wall for the rest of their lives. Old habit, old wisdom. The body remembers what the mind has been taught, and it does not easily forget. Solveig grew to be a grandmother herself, eventually, and she told the stories in exactly the way they had been told to her. Because some knowledge is too important to soften. To the Norse mind, an empty night was a contradiction in terms. The night was many things: dangerous, cold, disorienting, long, but it was never empty. The same darkness that pressed against the long house walls was populated thickly and specifically with presences that the people of this world had named and categorized with the same practical thoroughness they applied. Ed to livestock breeds and weather patterns, these were not vague supernatural anxieties floating at the edges of imagination. They were detailed, locally specific, behaviorally predictable entities that existed in a cosmology as coherent and internally consistent as any belief system ever constructed by human minds, trying to make sense of a world that was very often senseless. The Huldra moved through the forest and was beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. The Draugr rose from the burial mound and wanted, above all things, what it had lost: warmth, company, the world of the living, and its wanting was terrible. The Nisei inhabited the farmstead and required specific acknowledgement, specific offerings, specific respect, and withdrew its protection sharply and completely when these things were not given. The dead at certain times of year were not merely gone, they were present at the edges of the known world, and the boundary between their presence and yours was thinner at night, thinner in winter, thinner in silence. This was not primitive thinking. It is important to sit with that for a moment to resist the comfortable condescension of the modern mind toward the past. This was a coherent system for understanding a world in which things happened that required explanation: illness, accident, crop failure, the sudden death of livestock, the sound in the dark that had no visible source. Every culture that has ever existed has built explanatory frameworks for the inexplicable. The Norse built theirs with extraordinary detail and internal consistency, and they took it seriously in the way that serious people take seriously the things that matter to survival. A farmer named Thorvald made an offering to the Nice at the corner of his barn every midwinter without fail, not because he had seen the Nicer, not because he could have produced evidence of its existence in a nigh form a skeptic would accept, but because his father had done it, and his father's father, and the farm had endured when other farms in the valley had not, and Thorvald was not interested in testing the hypothesis by stopping. This is what the silence of a Viking night was filled with: not nothing, never nothing, but with the accumulated belief of a people who had learned over generations that the world was inhabited beyond what the eye could see, and that the appropriate response to that inhabitation was not denial but attention. They listened to the dark because the dark, in their understanding, was listening back. And in that reciprocal listening, in that careful mutual regard between the human settlement and the night it had been built against, there was a logic so old it had long since stopped being logic and had simply become instinct. The fire burned, the walls held, and the night, full to its edges with everything that had ever been named or left nameless, continued its ancient conversation with the living. He had taken the watch because no one else would take it that particular night, and Ulf had never been good at letting a silence go unfilled. He was not young, 43 in a time when 43 was the age at which a man's body began its honest conversation with him about everything it had endured. His hands were scarred in the specific way of hands that had worked at things for decades without pause, a nick across the right palm from a blade that had slipped, a knot of old tissue on the left forefinger that he could not remember earning. He had been a fisherman, and then a farmer, and then, because the settlement needed someone for it, and he was still standing, a watchman on the nights when the younger men could not face it. He stood at the edge of the settlement in the dark, in the particular cold that arrives after midnight in Scandinavia, and aches itself at home in the joints. And he looked at the tree line and he thought about his daughter's wedding, which was to happen in 4 months, and whether there would be enough fish smoked by then to feed the people who would come. This is what a watchman thinks about, not heroism, not the darkness, not the abstract weight of being the only thing between a sleeping village and whatever the night might send. He thinks about the wedding and the fish, and whether his wife had remembered to put the extra wool blanket on their youngest son's sleeping platform, because the boy always kicked his off in the night, and then woke up cold and miserable, and blamed everyone around him for it. He had watched 1,000 nights, perhaps more. The dark had become, in its way, a companion, not a comfortable one, never exactly that, but a known one. He understood its patterns. He understood when the quality of the silence changed, when the animal sounds shifted, register, when the cold on his face arrived from a slightly different direction and meant that the wind had turned and the weather would change by morning. He was watching on a night when the silence was wrong. He could not have said what made it wrong. It was not a sound he heard. It was the absence of sounds that should have been there. The small rustlings of nocturnal animals going about their work, the distant call of a bird in the forest, the ordinary texture of a night doing what nights do. All of it had gone still. Ulf stood very quietly and let his eyes move slowly along the tree line, not searching frantically, because frantic searching is how the eye misses things, but looking the way he had taught himself to look over 4 decades of being a person who paid attention to the world. He saw nothing. He heard nothing. He took 3 careful steps backward toward the settlement, never turning his back to the trees, and then he made the sound, low, controlled, the particular call that meant wake up but don't make noise. And the settlement stirred around him like something surfacing from deep water. Whatever had been out there was not there by morning. But Ulf stood watch until the light came, and he did not think about the wedding once. The light came slowly, the way it always does in the north. Not as a sudden arrival, but as a gradual argument, a grey-blue convincing of the sky that the dark had held long enough and might consider releasing its grip. Astrid was the first out of the long house. She always was. There was bread to begin, there was water to collect, there was the 100 practical urgencies of a morning that began early and ended late, and she had long since stopped waiting for the light to be confident before she stepped into it. She opened the long house door and stood for a moment in the threshold, one hand on the frame, and looked at the settlement. Everything was where it had been the night before. This sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. It was the thing, the first and most essential morning accounting, the one that happened before breakfast, before conversation, before any of the day's business. Everything in its place meant the night had been endured. The pen was standing. The storehouse was closed. The path between buildings was undisturbed. The morning was offering tentatively a return to the ordinary. She stepped outside and the cold received her, and she breathed it in with the particular gratitude of someone who has spent a long night aware that the morning was not guaranteed. Ragnhild had been awake through all of it, of course, all of the long dark hours, all of Ulf's careful vigil, all of the silence that had pressed against the settlement like a held breath. She was tending the fire when Astrid came in for warmth, and she looked up with eyes that were tired but clear. And she did not say anything about the night, neither did Astrid. There was an etiquette to mornings after difficult nights. You did not name the thing that had frightened you while it was still recent. You let the ordinary business of the day arrive first. Let the light do its work of convincing the body that the world was manageable. Children came tumbling out of sleep with the guileless energy of small creatures who had slept straight through everything. A baby began to cry and was lifted and settled. The old grandmother emerged from her sleeping platform, and stood by the fire and held her hands toward it with the slow ceremonial gratitude of the very old receiving warmth. Leif checked the goat pen. The goats were fine, alive, composed, no sign of disturbance. He stood there in the morning cold and looked at them for a moment longer than the task required, and then he went back inside. By mid-morning, the settlement was entirely itself again. The sound of tools, the smell of food, the particular human noise of people in close proximity going about the work of staying alive. The night had receded to where it always receded in daylight, becoming something that would only fully return to the body later, in the quiet before sleep. Ulf sat by the fire and accepted a bowl of something warm from a woman whose name he kept forgetting. He was sorry for this, genuinely, and he held it in both his scarred hands and felt the heat come through. He did not speak of the tree line, he did not speak of the silence. He drank, and he was warm, and for now, that was everything. There is a moment, you may have had it, when you wake in the night and the room is wrong. Not dangerous, not actually wrong, but the quality of the silence is off in a way you cannot name, and for just a breath, just one unguarded second before reason reasserts itself, something very old inside you is paying the most complete attention it has ever paid to anything. Your eyes open fully. Your body does not move. You are listening with every part of yourself that knows how to listen, and you are doing it without deciding to, because that part of you does not need a decision. It has been doing this for a very long time. That response is not a flaw. It is not anxiety, not irrationality, not the nervous system misfiring in a world it was not built for. It is memory. Specifically, it is the memory of every Astrid who lay still in the dark with her hand pressed flat against the rough wool beneath her. Every Ragnhild who sat up straighter when the old dog went quiet. Every Ulf who let his eyes move slowly along a tree line he could barely see, trusting something older than thought to tell him if the night had changed. They are in you, not metaphorically, literally. Their vigilance, their learned attention to the texture of silence, their ability to feel when the dark had shifted its weight, all of it shaped the line of people that eventually, through centuries and continents and every conceivable transformation of human life, arrived at you. The ones who slept without listening were not your ancestors. The ones who listened are. This is the quiet strangeness of thinking about the Viking night from where you now lie, warm, safe, in a world saturated with light and noise that keeps the dark at a comfortable distance. Those people were not so different from you. They loved their children with the same ferocity. They worried about small things alongside the large ones. They found comfort in fire and in company, and in the particular relief of a morning that followed a difficult night. They told stories to make the dark legible, and they tended flames to make the dark navigable. And they stood watch so that the people sleeping behind them could sleep without knowing someone was watching. 1,000 years is a very long time. And it is also no time at all when you measure it in heartbeats. The fear of silence, the specific animal alertness that arrives when a night goes too quiet, is not something civilization has talked you out of. It has only given you different ways to manage it. The light left on in the hallway, the television murmuring in the next room, the phone face up on the nightstand, its screen a small domestic fire. We are still doing what Ragnhild did. We are still keeping something burning through the dark. So if tonight, just before sleep, the quiet feels a little heavier than usual, if something in you stills and listens without quite knowing why, do not reach for an explanation. Just breathe. You come from people who knew how to do this, people who sat with the dark and faced it and made it to morning. You will too.